Welcome to lesson 1 on your student engagement mini course. So excited to have you along. And so today we're starting with 3 factors that affect engagement. And so first, we really need to talk about what is engagement and what do I mean by that? And so what I mean by that, are your students actively engaged in the learning process? Are they actively learning? Are they paying attention, or are they distracted, or something else? And so to me, that's engagement. Are your students engaged in the learning process? And there are 3 primary factors that affect engagement. So first, there's you. Your presence, how prepared you are, what you're doing, you're part of the process. Okay. Second, in each individual student, are they engaged or not? And then finally, the class as a whole. Because if you've taught for any length of time, you know that every class has its own personality. You have that class sometimes that's the chatty class. You have that class that's the studious, just get to work, put your nose to the grindstone and go class. And then you have those classes that you just makes your hair turn gray or fall out, whatever the case may be. And so we've all had those. But what I want to start with this is this question. Which of these do we have control of? For ourselves, that's the primary place where we have control. That we have control over, are we prepared for class? Do we, and then a lot of the other things we're going to look at in this series of lessons, are we doing those things? Are we pacing well? Are we speaking in a way that the kids can understand? Are we connecting with them? Are we, treating them with a way that they're going to respond well in class, and our relationship with them? All of those things come into play to affect engagement. And those are all things that are in our hands. And that's one of the primary things we're going to be looking at through this mini course. With students and with the class, those are things that are outside of our control. We can control how we respond to them. We can choose how we respond when a student chooses to misbehave. We can choose how we respond when a student doesn't study for a test and does poorly. But we cannot choose to study for them. We cannot choose if they're going to decide to misbehave or not. We don't have control over those things. We can't choose our class roster. We just get it. We can just choose how we respond, how we do a seating chart, even though in some classes there is no good seating chart, which is always frustrating. But we have to understand that our students are going to make choices. And so when I'm talking about engagement, what I'm talking about is, once again, students being actively engaged in the learning process. And I generally limit this to willing students, that I judge myself and I evaluate myself based on how my willing students are doing. If a student is willing to learn and is willing to do the work, that's what I'm looking at. Because every now and then you get that kid who's just like, I ain't doing nothing. And that's kind of their mindset. And no matter what you do, they're not going to do the work. No matter what you do, they're not going to pay attention in class. And if a kid's going to just be that way, then they're not your responsibility, because you cannot control their choices. You control how you respond to it, and we'll talk about that in classroom management. But, that's not our responsibility. And so the first big thing we got to understand is, what is our role and what is our part? We got to make sure we don't take responsibility for things that are not ours. For years, I would beat myself up for my students doing badly on a test. And it's like, finally learned that that's their choice. They chose whether to study or not. They chose, to stay up and watch Netflix all night long instead of looking at their stoichiometry test stuff. That's their choice. I'm not responsible for that. And that's a big deal. Next, I want to look at what are the 3 enemies of engagement. Basically things that we can be looking at and saying, if we see one of these 3, it's kind of a red flag waving. And we're like, ooh, I need to do something about this. And so first one is confusion. If your kids are saying, this is too hard, I don't get it, or something along those lines, that's a red flag. Because when a kid's confused, they're not going to be paying attention most of the time, especially if they get to a certain point. There's kind of a tipping point. A little bit of confusion, sometimes that motivates kids to come back and work harder and try harder, be more engaged. But there's definitely a tipping point that when they get to a certain point of engagement, they just kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, oh, I'm done. And you may lose them for that unit. You may lose them for the rest of the year. But we got to be mindful of that. We got to be mindful of when we see confusion, being on alert and being like, whoa, okay, they're confused. What does that mean? Am I going too fast? Am I not saying it the right way? Can I say it a different way? Can I slow down? Can we go over this again in a different way? What do we need to do? And it's our cue to start looking at the engagement and how to improve it. Because if we allow confusion to persist, it is not a good thing. All right, boredom is kind of the flip side to me. Like you're going too slow, or you're not pushing your kids quite enough. That's another thing that just, if kids bored, they're going to check out. This child here is not engaged at all. And then that leads to the third one, which we see up here, is just distraction. They're going to distract themselves with all sorts of means. Whether it's a cell phone, talking to a neighbor, studying for a different class, whatever. These are enemies to engagement. These are things which threaten your ability to teach. Now, some lessons are just boring. There's just not, it's really hard to go through atomic history or really even quantum history, or periodic trends in a way that's super exciting and interactive. And that's part of those lessons. They're tougher. But if those are the minority, the minor part of your teaching day, the minority of your time, then that works well. If the majority of your time is more interactive, more involving the kids, not bored, then a little bit of boredom is not going to be that big deal. It's when we get lots of boredom, or we get a high percentage of boredom amongst the class, that we've got to be like, ooh, something's going on. I need to switch things up. I need to change something. Same thing with distraction. A lot of times distraction is their own choices, but sometimes it's something that we need to be aware of, but we also have to limit it. When we see distractions, remove them. Somehow squelch them. We can do that in classroom management when we talk about that, but we need to remove distractions as much as possible and minimize their impact as much as possible. And so there are just ways to do that, and we need to be aware of those things. And so when we start talking here about engagement, think in these terms all the way through the other 11 lessons. What are you in control of? What do you have power over, and what can you change? If we take responsibility for things that are not ours, which is, things that are the students' choices or the classroom dynamics and the class's choices, we'll drive ourselves mad and we won't be able to focus and do what we need to do. And so that's important. So that's what your action point is for this first lesson. Identify what aspects of your class you are responsible for you, for your students, and for your class. And that's kind of a great place to start, of just kind of like, all right, what's my lane? What's my stuff? And to not get too worried about literally every aspect of your class, because that's not all of it's your responsibility. So let's identify what's yours. And so write that down in your workbook, and it's a great place to get started. And so that's lesson one. And then we're going to move into really the big applicable strategies here in lesson two with student-driven pacing. I look forward to seeing you there.